One of the things that make literature and art and things like that so great is that a single work can be interpreted in 1,000 different ways, and every single one of those interpretations can be just as valid as any other. Ask any one person who has seen the Mona Lisa's smile, for example, and their answers will vary wildly, with some people thinking she looks mysterious or even seductive, while others still might judge her to be completely indifferent. This, however, is not the case with Wicked. In fact, the only interpretation of the 2024 film that makes any sense at all, that brings together all aspects of the movie, is this: Wicked is actually a massively complex metaphor for the Cold War. Galinda is a pretty superficial character in this movie. She's self-obsessed and cares entirely too much about popularity, as can and should be gathered by the song Popular. Now, most of what I'm going to say in this section is pretty self-evident, so I don't feel like I need to get into it too deeply, but we're talking about a character who loves clothes, is one of the most powerful students at Shiz, and who has most of the student body at her beck and call. This should be screaming America already, right? I mean, bald eagles should be flying out of this woman's million cupboards. Essentially, Galinda's clear influence over Shiz is very much reminiscent of American capitalist ideals and the way they were pervasive all throughout the Western world. The fact that Galinda constantly mispronounces words, for example, can mostly be viewed as a reference to the use of secrecy and coding that was so prevalent throughout the Cold War as the United States and Russia spied on each other. More importantly, we see all of this in her attitude in general. The emblematic rags to riches sort of situation that embodies the American dream is present here in the way she wants to study sorcery, but is not particularly good at it. This also works in a secondary way, as the fact that Galinda is an extremely privileged individual who only seems to be interested in maintaining the status quo as opposed to reinventing it is very much on brand for capitalist corporate America. It is this love of the status quo precisely the thing that puts her at odds with the other protagonist of the film, Elphaba. If Glinda is a cinematic metaphor for the United States, then it stands that Elphaba, her bitter rival throughout the film and play, is the Soviet Union. Now, the most glaring evidence against this theory is the obvious problem of her skin being green. It was honestly a pretty big issue for me at first, right? How could a character so emblematic of Soviet communist ideals not be red? I quickly realized that this was actually a genius move by the creators of Wicked, who clearly felt that having a red woman with communist tendencies might be as equally on the nose as a wart on a witch. Instead, let's think about it this way. The creators of Wicked could have chosen any color they wanted, and yet they chose green. Most people might give a myriad reasons as to why, something about green being evil or something along those lines. Let us not forget, however, the fact that color theory tells us that green and red are actually opposites, and that this movie, and Oz in general, behaves in a way much like American propaganda has always done towards communism. It's vilified. As such, just as communism is seen as the worst thing on earth by the American people, so is the Wicked Witch of the West viewed by the people of Oz. The color green in this case goes from being a massive hole in this cinematic theory to an absolutely genius move by the creators of this work. In choosing green, the opposite of red, they are in essence performing the same function that Wicked itself does, essentially to ask, is the Wicked Witch really wicked? Is communism really, well, red? And so the parallels to Soviet Russia continue. Elphaba, rejected by her father, is raised by a bear, one of Russia's most important symbols according to most Americans, then spends most of the film trying to create some sort of equality within her school by essentially leveling the status quo. Elphaba is quickly embraced by her professors, much the same way that communism was by various academic circles during the Cold War. Her sister, much like other smaller Slavic countries that eventually seceded from the USSR, is depicted as weaker and in this case disabled, and so on and so forth. The movie opens with the death of the Wicked Witch, which we can very simply assume is the dissolution of the USSR. Water, in this case, was the thing that ultimately killed the witch, in much the same way that a bucket of unrest caused Mr. Gorbachev to allow the independence of most other Soviet republics in 1991. At the same time, it's Galinda who will be telling the story to her people, much like how continued US propaganda has shaped our understanding of the USSR as blatantly evil. Now, when we first see Elphaba entering Shiz, most students are rightfully shocked, and we see a little moment when Elphaba's father gifts his younger daughter, Elphaba's sister, a pair of beautiful slippers. This here is a massively important moment as it represents the actual creation of the USSR itself. Elphaba, being a symbol for communist Russia, is put in direct contrast to her father, a man who ultimately represents Russia's soon-to-be-abolished monarchy and the pre-Bolshevik revolutionist ideals. Just like how Russia's communist revolution ultimately ended the monarchy, Elphaba wrestles herself out from under her father's reign and is enrolled at Shiz in order to pursue her education. Now, there are many ways of looking at this film, but unfortunately a perfect chronological retelling of the Cold War is not one of them. Instead, we must suffice with the fact that this movie rather alludes to very specific moments during that period and puts them in a seemingly random order. Following Elphaba's first musical number about how she hopes that she will be able to meet the Wizard of Oz, we find ourselves in our two protagonists' dorm room where they are each writing a letter home. Now, this is important because it alludes to the various manners in which the USSR and America communicated during those times. Essentially, unlike now where we have phones, instant messaging, and video calls, people back then had to speak to each other in incredibly slow ways and actually had to write things down with pen and paper. Had this not been the case, had there been more easy and open communication between these two superpowered political rivals, who knows if we would have had a Cold War at all? Perhaps, maybe, just a slightly warm moment of tension, but little else. This is exactly what the movie is trying to get at this point. It is essentially criticizing the Cold War's inability for communication and the lacking technology of what could have basically been considered the Stone Age. This is then furthered, of course, by the song What Is This Feeling?, where we get great insight into the way the USA and USSR felt about each other during that era. Immediately following the Loathing song comes what I believe is one of the more important parts of the film, the classroom scene. Now, this is, of course, a biting critique of McCarthyism. As we know, McCarthyism, considered the Second Red Scare, was the political repression and persecution of left-leaning individuals within the United States. In this case, the left-leaning victims of the McCarthy era are represented very clearly by the Animals of Oz, not only by the fact that they are a group of academics, as many communists back then were too, but by the fact that Elphaba, who is representative of the USSR, is hugely in favor of animal rights and greatly empathetic to their cause. Now, I think even more telling is the fact that the GOAT professor, Dr. Dillamond, is unable to pronounce Galinda's name correctly.
Yes, Miss Glinda.
This is a huge indicator of this theory being true. If we really think about it, the only letter the professor is unable to pronounce when he tries is the letter A, which of course is the first letter in America. More importantly, the amount of scrutiny and discrimination the GOAT faces is quite reminiscent of that of the infamous J. Robert Oppenheimer, who we all know had an incredibly important hand in the creation of the first atomic bomb, and who was later deemed an enemy of the state by the American government for previous ties to the Communist Party. Oh, and by the way, these are just clips of the Oppenheimer movie. That's actor Cillian Murphy, not the actual Oppenheimer. The last thing I want to do is mislead anybody. Just want to make that incredibly clear. But I digress. Dr. Dillamond's inability to pronounce the letter A is not only a reference to America itself, but to the fact that Oppenheimer's allegiance to his own country was questioned so aggressively. If this were the case for you, you might also find it hard to pronounce the letter A in most instances, and especially when you're talking to the metaphorical representation of the very thing that burned you in Galinda. Not only are these things bitingly true, but the letter A is also, perhaps not too coincidentally, the same letter with which the word atom begins, a reference to Oppenheimer's great creation, no doubt. In this case, in having the GOAT unable to say this single syllable, Wicked is geniusly alluding to the Oppenheimer trials that came as a direct result of bombing US-Soviet relations, no pun intended, the bomb itself, the fact that Oppenheimer is vastly considered the GOAT of science, and the fact that Wicked and Gladiator have been competing with the films Oppenheimer and Barbie to be the most popular double features of all time. Now let's talk about Prince Fiyero. I don't think it's necessary to dance around the subject here because it's pretty obviously clear. Fiyero is John F. Kennedy. Dashingly good looks aside, Fiyero, much like JFK, did have what might be considered by American standards to be somewhat socialist tendencies. His New Frontier agenda, which promised to give aid to cities in order to improve housing and transportation, unemployment benefits, and other anti-poverty legislations, can be seen represented in Wicked by having the prince not immediately despise Elphaba for her green skin. This is, of course, furthered by the fact that Fiyero almost immediately enters a relationship with Galinda, a fact that clearly is meant to represent the idea that JFK was one of the United States' youngest presidents. The one number that Fiyero is given in this film, the song Dancing Through Life, is about how it's better not to think too much about things. Originally, I had quite a bit of trouble putting this and JFK together. However, it quickly became apparent that to dance through life is very much the same thing as, quote-unquote, having your head in the clouds, something that JFK was extraordinarily famous for, given that he was the United States' biggest proponent in having a space race with Soviet Russia and the direct cause of the 1969 moon landings. Perhaps most telling, and possibly most, as the kids would say nowadays, savage, is the allusion to the JFK assassination, which occurs right before Galinda and Elphaba board the train for Emerald City. At this moment, Galinda says that Fiyero has begun to think, something that she does not quite like. This is a direct reference to the fact that JFK was ultimately killed for reasons unknown, but most likely for his role in the Cold War itself and in his certain attraction for Elphaba. If we take this even farther, we know that Fiyero is the prince who would eventually become the Scarecrow in The Wizard of Oz, a character who, much like JFK right after his assassination, completely lacks brains. All of this ultimately culminates in the dance scene, where Elphaba and Galinda finally put their differences aside and tried to work together, much like the USSR and USA did after the Russian revolutions of 1989. At that point, as we know, it was Gorbachev and then President Bush Sr. who met in Malta, just like in Wicked, an island surrounded by their peers, in order to discuss their future relationship. The number that follows features Galinda teaching Elphaba how to be popular. Now, I've already more or less discussed this very song, but I think it's important to look at it with a tiny bit more detail. Just like how the US was able to more or less enforce all of their terms during the Malta summit, so does Galinda teach Elphaba about style and how to flick her hair correctly. These are more or less in line with the decision to ultimately work towards the reunification of Germany, the resolution of third world conflicts, and the promotion of peace and democracy. Now begins, I think, one of the more difficult and complex parts of the film, when Elphaba and Galinda head off to Emerald City. It is now that I think is most important to direct our attention to the train that they take. This is particularly significant because of the way that the train seems to function. If we notice, this train specifically is not constructed the way most trains would be. It is instead very much reminiscent of a clock. This is important because while we have more or less been following a somewhat chronological order with regards to the events of the Cold War, it is here where time ceases to be linear. It is precisely with this strange-looking train that the creators of Wicked emphatically let us know that things are about to get, well, a little strange. Because Emerald City is where the movie essentially abandons the references to the Cold War directly, and instead turns to a critique of communist and capitalist systems. This is perhaps most prevalent in the idea of the Wizard of Oz himself. As we know, the movie has us believing that green directly references communist ideals, and having the wizard himself be shown as green, the film is giving us a look at what communism unfortunately seems to always devolve into when implemented in the real world. That is, not a stateless, classless, and moneyless society, but rather a state with a very strong class system, i.e. Stalinism, essentially. The way we can view this, quite simply, is that the wizard and Madame Morrible wish to use Elphaba, in essence communism, to exact control over others in much the same way that the USSR and other communist republics have done so in the past. The movie, therefore, has turned from a simple retelling of the Cold War into a biting critique of how the powerful use various ideologies to retain a certain status quo from which they benefit. Now those are some serious vegetables. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and let me know your thoughts in the comments.